So given our focus on divine simplicity today, could you provide a more in-depth? So I can imagine our listeners wondering, like, what on earth are you guys talking about? What is divine simplicity? So, maybe you could provide a more in-depth explanation of what this doctrine entails, and what are the agreed upon implications of divine simplicity, which is recognized by both its advocates and its critics. And I acknowledge that critics of divine simplicity may assert implications not granted by the other side. But at this stage, I'm mainly interested in understanding the common ground regarding the doctrine's implications, which everyone would agree with and say, yeah, that's what it actually teaches.
Yeah, because we don't want to jump to anything without argument yet. So yeah, so what's the common ground here? So divine simplicity is this attribute which says God does not have any attributes. And that sounds incoherent on its face, but that's not my fault. Like, that's the way, like, you see it articulated. And so you see this like in Augustine, you see this in Moses Maimonides, Aquinas.
Would they actually call divine simplicity an attribute?
Yes, this is what's so weird. So I just did an episode of my own podcast on this recently where I say this, and then I'm like playing clips of some different thinkers, and they're like, divine simplicity is the attribute. And so and so I'm just like, it's the attribute where he has no. Okay, cool. Keep going. Because it's just so obviously weird. But this is the claim. The claim is God does not have any attributes. God has no properties, no tropes, no immanent universals, nothing of like that, like none whatsoever. Even no accidental properties. So accidental properties like being the creator, being the Lord, or the judge of all men. These are accidental properties. God can't have anything like that because he can't have any properties. Which is why I find it really weird when I see a lot of these internet Thomists online saying, well, God's got Cambridge properties. I'm like, what part of no properties do you not understand? I'm sorry. It's very clear.
And Thomists are those who follow the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, right?
Yeah. The problem is, like, you know how you've got different divisions, like with amongst Islamic thinkers. When you're looking at Aquinas, you've got an insane number of people going, no, what Aquinas really said was this. No, what he really said was this.
So they're not monolithic. Okay.
No, not at all. No, not even close. I find it. I think there's handbooks been written on it, and they'll be like, here's 24 different, and I'm like, 24 different versions. What? Okay. Anyway, so the classical theists are going to say a few more things. They'll say, when we talk about God's attributes, his essential attributes, what we're saying, all of those things you want to predicate of God, they're all identical to each other. So omnipotence is identical to omniscience, and so on. And all those things are identical to God's essence and existence. And then, so when you think of like creatures like you and I, like we're like substances, we have properties, or we like instantiate properties, these properties inhere in us, something like that. When you're looking at the simple God, you're going to say, no. There's just this simple, undivided substance with no distinctions, no properties, nothing intrinsic or extrinsic about it. It's just God, or existence itself, or however you want to say it. Further, the simple God is purely actual, which just means no potential whatsoever. Because there's this assumption in a lot of the classical thinkers that if you possess potential and you move from potential to actual, well, then you're not going to be immutable. And remember earlier, the classical theist we talked about says God's immutable, cannot change. So you got to get rid of that kind of claim. So gods have to have pure actuality. He's never going to have potential that eventually actualizes, because that would be a change, and you can't have that.
So you said something interesting there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, you said that, according to them, that because God is timeless and immutable, they would argue that God must be simple. But clearly not everyone agrees with that, because, I mean, Imams al-Ghazali and al-Maturidi, for example, would affirm that God is timeless and immutable, yet still affirm attributes for him. So I don't want to cut your train of thought or digress, but would it be accurate to say that everyone agrees that if you do affirm that God is simple, then he must be timeless and immutable, but people disagree as to whether divine simplicity is a necessary implication of affirming timelessness and immutability?
Yes, I think that's right. The classical theist is going to disagree with both of us, though, because they're going to say, no, these things all hang together. Whereas I want to go, I think they can come apart. I really do. So you'll typically see them say, like, these four attributes, they necessarily entail one another. Whereas I've written papers going, I don't see the entailment. I really don't.
So they would tell Imams al-Ghazali and Maturidi that they're being inconsistent.
Correct. Yeah. They're going to say, like, look, if you really want God to be timeless, then you're going to have to, it has to be simple. You got to, and so they're going to try to draw out these. So there's arguments to be had there. But that's, which is really good to help you kind of understand some of the background assumptions of how these classical theists are getting to simplicity.
Hmm.
And let me mention like a few other details about simplicity. So another one is when you're looking at this claim that God's pure actuality, part of that involves the idea that God does not have a bunch of distinct actions. Instead, all the things you want, all the actions God performs are identical to each other. So there's just one act, and that one act is identical to God's essence and existence. And so you'll see people say God just is an act. So Catherine Rogers will say this, and she'll say, I know that sounds weird, but lots of things sound weird. So there's this, God's an act. What do you want? Like, it's no big deal. Now you might be going, how are we getting some of this? Like how does it actually work?
How can an act have consciousness? How can an act? Yeah,
Right. Well, this is the exact questions, and this is why, like, when you're reading Kate's work, she goes, I know it sounds weird, but lots of things sound weird when we're talking about God, so it's fine. And for me, like, I think that's super weird. But the weirdness for me also is in other places going, why do I have to say all these things are identical to each other? Like why is this? And it's because there's this other assumption in the background about mereology, or parts and wholes, and assumptions about like how parts and wholes are composed. And when you're looking at these thinkers, they're going to say just everything under the sun counts as a part. So genus, differentia, forms, accidental properties, essence, existence, these are metaphysical parts. And when I hear the kind of claim like existence is a part, so if I asked you, like, like, oh, did you see this movie the other day? And you're like, oh yeah, right, it was a good movie. And I'm like, what was your favorite part of the movie? And you're like, existence. I'm just, I don't know. It sounds super weird to me, but that's what you need to say to kind of understand like these people are trying to justify simplicity. They're like, all this is parts, so we can't have parts in God. So all these things are parts. So we gotta have some sort of identity kind of claim. Mm-hmm. One final claim. This is very important. There's no distinctions in God. And this is the thing I've had the hardest time when I'm trying to debate Christians on this, because they just don't want to believe that this is what all their favorite dead thinkers are really saying. They're like, no. Surely they made distinctions all the time. I'm like, yeah, distinctions though. You can't have any distinctions of the simple God, because distinctions imply multiplicity, and multiplicity, according to these thinkers, apparently implies metaphysical parts. And you'll see this. The strongest claim is you can't even have conceptual distinctions in God. So conceptual distinctions that make up in my mind, those can't even apply to God. And you see this very clearly in St. Anselm. He says this in multiple places. Ibn Sina says this. Maimonides says this over and over again. And Nicole Orsamy and Catherine Rogers, they're all like, yeah, conceptual distinctions cannot apply to God, because whatever can be divided in my mind can be divided in reality, apparently. So no conceptual distinctions for God. So this is the doctrine of divine simplicity.
So in a nutshell, divine simplicity teaches that God has no attributes, even if those attributes are abstract or identity-based, so to speak. So God does not have the attribute of knowledge. God does not have the attribute of power. God does not have the rank of creator, and so on. So divine simplicity advocates would, I mean, they would still say that God knows and creates, but they do not say that he has the attribute of knowledge or can be described with the title creator. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
You would not call God creator.
Well, it's weird. So Augustine has got this long passage because he's worried about God having relational. This is what he says: relational properties, like being the creator or being the Lord, because those are things that imply a relationship. Because you can't be a creator unless you create something. You can't be Lord unless you've got a thing to lord over. And he's like, well, then God wouldn't be timeless. He wouldn't be immutable. He wouldn't be simple. What do I do? And he says, well, when I say that God is the creator, I'm really saying something about me, because God's not really related to the universe. So we cannot have these accidental relational properties. So I can say God's creator all day long, but somehow I'm saying something about myself. And that's the part where I'm like, I don't think you really mean that, but he says it over and over again. And you see this a lot in the Christian tradition.